Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-owner with Impetus Digital. We've built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We work with life science companies from across the globe and have done so for the last 13 years. We help companies do things like virtual advisory boards, virtual steering committees, investigator groups, medical education. And since the launch of Insight Events, we're helping companies do MSL and sales training events, corporate meetings, and hackathons, and all kinds of other things. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, digital provocateurs, entrepreneurs, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. But it doesn't just start with a conversation. We need to build and sustain these conversations. It's precisely the reason why we help our clients do things asynchronously and synchronously through a series of touch points over time, so we can work on policies and procedures, share insights, create opportunities for serendipitous, collisions of thinking and insight, so that we can move agendas forward, think about beyond the pill solutions, and really do something that's innovative and inventive. So I'm really thrilled to have one of these digital thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Dr. Jody Ranck. He has over 30 years of experience working in the global health arena, and his work has spanned from everything from human rights to health technology. He is the author of 2 books on digital health, and he's a globally recognized thought leader on digital health. And he's been listed in the always on top 100 minds in the global M Health. He's a frequent keynote speaker at health IT conferences, and he's organized and chaired the Healthcare Blockchain Summit, both in 2017 as well as in 2018. He's currently the EVP of Global Health Strategy at RAM Global, as well as a senior analyst covering AI and analytics for Chillmark Research. He's been a frequent advisor to large healthcare companies and startups focusing on providing more patient-centric care and value-based healthcare. He's also that's not all. He's also the CEO of the early startup company Chrysalis Labs. And this company actually focuses on blockchain applications in healthcare, digital asset management, finance, as well as government services. Jody actually graduated, including a doctorate in public health from the University of California in Berkeley, as well as an MA in international relations and economics from Johns Hopkins University, as well as a BA in biology from Ithaca College. Welcome, Jody. So happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you. What an impressive background and resume. I'm curious, you're doing a lot of really innovative, leading edge, bleeding edge things in AI and elsewhere, especially around blockchains. A lot of people don't really understand that. Tell us a little bit about your trajectory in your career, the things that you learned along the way, and what made you land where you are today.
Sure. Well, my trajectory is a little bit unorthodox in some ways. I started out as a pre-med major in undergrad and applied to medical school, got in, and then because I loved foreign languages, I decided to hold off on medical school for a while. And actually, that's how I ended up in an international relations program. And ended up in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, in 1989, when all those changes were, the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that. And that's what gave me the social science bug. So I went from being a molecular biologist to really getting into the social sciences, and spent the next few years working at a Fulbright scholarship to work in Bangladesh with Grameen Bank, the Bank for Rural Landless Women, and Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize for his work there in 2006, and just got deeper into the social sciences. So I ended up getting my doctorate in public health to kind of split the difference between social sciences and medicine. It's one way, public health, I could use the social science skills far more. And from there, I worked in Rwanda after the genocide, and that's actually where I started to get engaged with mobiles in M Health. and that when I first arrived in Bangladesh or Rwanda, the situation was quite challenging, and it just 1 in 7 Rwandese had been either refugee, either killed, and then like another 1 in 7, 2 in 7 ended up as refugees. But in the short course of a couple of years, mobile phones started popping up everywhere and really changing the way we think about healthcare, delivery of healthcare. And with some other trips to some other countries, I was like, aha, there's something going on here. So in the early 2000s, I ended up at a think tank in Silicon Valley, focusing on futures and forecasting, and really had the opportunity to dig into what we now call digital health. So that's how I ended up in the overall digital health space, in a rather circuitous route.
It's very, very interesting. And obviously there's lots of full of life and interest there. And I'm sure it's helped to illuminate a lot of the things that you're currently working on. So I'd like to explore, I mean, obviously many countries are just emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, there's many countries that are still right in the thick of it. Unfortunately, countries like India and others, we're hearing rumors of this fourth wave, because of some of the mutations. But regardless, we're hoping and seeing some of these countries and states and provinces opening up. But with all of that, there's been this emergency, and there's been this confluence of disaster recovery and politics and medicine and regulations and all kinds of things that there's just been a swirl around this in the last several months, if not the past year. So I'm curious around what is happening with RAM Global and the particular project that you're working on around virus detection, diagnosis, and treatment with this platform that you call ThEA platform. Can you tell us a little bit around what you are working on?
Sure. So a little bit of background about RAM Global is that we were started by Ayal Ram, and he, in his 20s, early 30s, he had a series of exits. And shortly after his second exit, he was diagnosed with a cancer. And they had missed it a year prior to him getting the formal diagnosis. And by the time he got the diagnosis, he only had a 5% probability of survival. And so he spent a lot of his own money and a year and a half in the hospital, and fortunately survived. And from that experience, he decided he was going to invest his small fortune into creating what he thought would be, the goal was to create the world's best diagnostic company for cancer screening, cancer diagnostics. So over time, we've branched out into a number of areas, and we focus on sensors and next generation sensors. Most of our sensors are based on for the non-ThEA, the non-ThEA platform, non-COVID diagnostic platforms, that we use gallium nitride rather than silicon. And so our sensors generally have about 1,000 times better signal to noise ratio. We can detect, we can monitor signals in the body that normally require like a heart catheterization and so forth. So this is sort of the bleeding edge sensors. So when COVID hit last year, we realized we had a terahertz sensor, and our terahertz sensors are not based on gallium nitride, but they can measure a certain wavelength in the spectrum. And we encountered some academic articles about how terahertz sensors, meaning semiconductor industry rather than biochemistry, such as PCR and lateral immunoflow assays, we could detect viruses much faster and every bit as accurate as PCR, but without the need for reagents and a complex supply chain that you need for PCR. So we really doubled down on developing this what we call our ThEA platform, which we can detect COVID in under 2 minutes from a oropharyngeal swab. And this is a digital diagnostic. So let's say tomorrow there is a new pathogen we need to monitor, a new epidemic breaks out. In contrast to PCR, PCR requires a sort of runway to develop, to create the reagents. so that you can run polymerase chain reaction with and diagnose whatever pathogen you're talking about. If we got a sample of an emerging pathogen at breakfast, by the time you went to bed tonight, we could, just as Tesla pushes out a software upgrade to their cars, all of our machines, we could push out a software upgrade to diagnose that pathogen, or most pathogens. There are some that we might have to utilize a different chip in our cartridge, but so that really creates a more agile, rapid reaction type of diagnostic. You'll still need PCR for molecular epidemiology and things like that, but it's far superior to the rapid tests that are antigen and antibody tests, which don't have very high sensitivity specificity levels. And we view it as a major breakthrough in the whole diagnostic area.
So you were mentioning, Jody, that this is a digital tool. How accessible is this going to be to the average person who's got a cell phone? And how are we going to start considering these diagnostics in the future? Are they going to be preemptive? Are we going to be reacting? What do you see as being the future? Not necessarily for COVID, although we can talk about how this can be, continued use today, but really in the future. So what does this look like?
So right now, the device itself is about the size of a laser printer that sits on your desk. And then we have slides are pretty much about the size of a microscope slide. So you use the swab and you wipe that on the slide and then insert that into the analyzer. We also have a breathalyzer we're working on that should be ready this year sometime, that you'll puff into several times. And that's very different from some of the other breathalyzers out there that are detecting the volatile organic compounds from your breath once you're infected. This will do direct detection of the virus. So, this type, the machine we have in its current state will be used in venues where you have large points of egress and ingress, like airports, stadiums, schools, things like that, where you have to process a lot of people quickly. That's what the like generation 1.0 of our device. But because we're a nanotech company, our roadmap down the road, and this may take several years, we ultimately would like to bring this down to the size of your mobile, so it could be an at-home device. But that's not where we are right now. We're a nanotech company, so things get smaller. We've taken the sensors you use to monitor air quality, for example, that are the big industrial grade ones that are the size of an Amazon delivery van. We've now brought that down to the size of a shoebox for like a large pair of boots, sort of that size. So as we progress, we will bring it down in size, and then it will be more of a consumer-facing device that you could use to detect bacteria or viruses in your home. So right now, it's more of a point of care type of device, and we always will be, I think, reacting. With outbreaks, the only thing you can do on the diagnostic side is react to when you discover detect the pathogen. So maybe there's diagnostics for other things that you might be able to take a more proactive approach, with like cancer screening and things like that, which that we will likely get back to before long as well.
Yeah, amazing. Very exciting stuff, and obviously a great piece of another part of the armamentarium that we're all using to fight this COVID war, and potentially moving forward, many other applications to other SARS viruses, other things that are going to be coming up in the future, and making this much more part of the overall well-being management, if you will, of the average health consumer. So I think that's actually very exciting. You were talking a little bit about the type of technology that this is. We're hearing a lot these days about supply chain issues, semiconductor shortages, and you were alluding to the whole GAN and AI GAN technology, and why this may outperform the typical silicon and semiconductors that we typically see in sensor tech, in the use of sensors. Can you speak a little bit more in depth about why you sort of see this being the future of, the actual materials, and why you see this, what you're using as being more of what we're going to be doing in the future?
Sure. And just to reiterate, the COVID diagnostic is not using a GaN sensor, but the best illustration of the distinction between GaN and silicon is our sensors that we use for monitoring your heart and lung function. So if you looked at a silicon chip under an electron microscope, you would see the surface of that chip is very jagged. So that means when particles hit that chip, particles that you're trying to detect hit the chip, they're scattered because of the jaggedness, and that creates noise. So that makes it hard to detect very subtle signals in the body. And if you compare that to gallium nitride, we can spontaneously grow a perfect crystalline structure on a chip. So the difference is like, if silicon is like if you drove a truck to a full blast into a forest, what would come out the other end might be 1 or 2 tires. But GaN would be like if you cleared the forest and the truck drove through with very little damage. So that's how we get that, the physics. There's a lot of interesting physics involved with this, obviously, in the material sciences. If you recall back to high school math and your Fibonacci numbers, our logo is a representation of Fibonacci numbers, because that's the lattice that we grow is indebted to Fibonacci sequences and so forth. So, these structures that you find in nature that enable that perfect crystalline lattice. But the difference in, the clinical difference is from touching any point on your body, we can do a full EKG, continuous blood pressure, heart rate variability, as well as we're able to get some of the pulmonary artery dynamics. It right now requires a heart catheterization where they implant the sensor inside the body. So we can get all of that data, and it's more accurate from several different vantage points. But the main thing is, if you look at the traditional sensor that's used in your Apple Watch, for example, for the EKG, you're measuring the depolarization of the whole heart. With our sensors, we're getting the electrical signals and the biomechanical movements of every cell in your heart and lungs, and then calculating that, producing that signal for your EKG on that. So we're getting a lot more data. So you can actually detect things. The future of that type of sensing will be that, we think down the road, there are devices that may cost hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions even, that we use, such as MRIs and CT scans, that eventually we may be able to do some of that with very low cost devices that can be in the home, where you're not exposed to radiation, they're non-invasive and so forth. That, when we get there is the big question. But it's not as far on that horizon as we used to think with some of the advances in material sciences.
That is incredibly exciting. Beyond it's that is a real democratization of the way diagnostics are done, wellness care is managed, and how we really look at sickness care in general. I was also,
and by the way, the price points are much lower too than silicon.
For sure.
So that means we can put a lot of these devices in the hands of frontline health workers in Africa, Asia, Latin America, things like that, at a fraction of the cost. And even our ThEA diagnostic, the cost per test is much lower than most PCR.
As I was alluding to earlier, we're all aware, anybody who is involved from cars to computer generation to creating fridges is aware of the semiconductor shortage. Many reasons for that, the supply chain issues, including COVID-19 and many other geopolitical reasons. So where does this play in terms of this sort of new technology? The ability to grow, if you will, these networks and these perfect crystals. Is this a method for us to overcome the excessive need that we've had on silicon? Is this going to be a new opportunity for us to build our new, another supply chain channel?
Well, for our non-COVID applications that use GaN, or the gallium nitride, one of the big innovations we've made there is what we call it the cluster, but it's a microfab that we can build on premises. So for some types of diagnostics we're developing, let's say a big diagnostic company wants to partner with us and use our platform, say our electronic ELISA platform that's in development when that's ready. The microfab can be built right there and produce fairly high volumes of chips per day. So you can, it's basically doing for fabrication of chips what 3D printers did for manufacturing in some sectors. That's one of the other advantages for some of our sensors. It's not the case for everything, but for some specific sensors, we can do this. We have this microfab route that's in development. They're pretty far along.
That's amazing.
Some of that got put on hold due to COVID to get COVID out the door, but it is attainable in short order.
Very, very, very interesting for sure. Anything that can start bringing things back at home, being able to have some control over supply, so you're not always, chasing after things or, going into these supply issues, is certainly going to be well received. Also want to talk about some of the technology behind the scenes that makes these sensors really smart. And you have built in some of this artificial general intelligence, or AGI, using some concepts around advanced quantum biosignal analytics. I know it sounds really confusing to people, but there's some really cool, smart things that you're doing. So tell us about some of the thinking that's been going on around the machine thinking and how this applies to these sensors that are picking up, biometrics and other important things from people's bodies.
Sure, and there's a distinction between standard machine learning and artificial general intelligence. We use machine learning on top of our. So in general, the machine learning aspect for RAM group is doing things like so the sensors are so sensitive, they detect when your body moves, that creates noise, and so we're getting these signals from all of your organs in your body. I was going to say, so your sweat glands actually act as antennae that we can pick up onto, and we can even do a biometric authentication type of thing from all the signals in your body. You have sort of a unique fingerprint. So because we're getting so much noise, especially with a body in motion, when a patient is sick in a bed, that's one thing. But like if for fitness or while you're moving, we have to use machine learning as a filter to try to filter out what we don't want to hear, and amplify and attenuate, synchronize the signal we get, so that it can be, we get a very unique signal. But we can also, if you go into the market right now with a device that produces a novel signal, you're going to get some pushback because people aren't used to that waveform that they're going to be seeing on a screen in front of them. They'll have to be trained and so forth. So we also can kind of bridge that gap and put all the data we get inside a waveform that or a signal that they'll recognize. And so that the machine learning aspect for us is in kind of managing that the output that we get in terms of that waveform, as well as noise and things we don't want to hear. Once we're in healthcare systems and so forth, there's another aspect that we'll use in a wearable to, identify anomaly detection. One of the advantages we have over the sensor used in an Apple Watch, for example, is we have a lower incidence of false positives for AFib, things like that, which really concerns cardiologists. If you have patients in the gym on their treadmill and they think they're having AFib situations and, kind of clog up the system, in terms of managing that service for the consumer, we will work with that, whomever we work with in the wearables industry. There'll be some sort of partnership around the AI development and that data that gets generated from our sensors.
So Jody, it sounds like, RAM is a really pivotal company when it comes to sort of the hardware and with some of the smartware as well, based on some of the machine learning and some of the algorithms built into how they're receiving this information. But there's all kinds of interesting tools or ultra field sensors that your company has been building. And I'm also curious about some of the potential partnerships that you have built utilizing some of these sensors. So one that I think of specifically is your electronic terahertz sensors. How is this currently being used for clinics or institutions who are doing imaging for patients? Can you tell, and who's using these types of sensors?
Well, right now, our focus is just in the use of the terahertz sensor. The main thrust is just that for the diagnostic purposes. There are terahertz sensors used in other types of, as you mentioned, medical imaging and other types of diagnostics. But for us at the moment, we're interested in, I think going forward, or the big focus for us is going to be getting into these sort of pandemic preparedness types of platforms where, there's a lot of talk about creating a global immune system, so to speak, where we develop on one hand, you need a strategy that develops vaccine platforms, and on the other hand, diagnostics. So harnessing the power of the terahertz sensors, and then increasingly bringing that cost down and simplifying the devices and making it as agile and pervasive as possible for that. Basically epidemiological surveillance is going to be our main focus for the near term. With the things like electronic ELISA, what we've learned from this process over this last year, where essentially we've done several years worth of work in 1 year because of the pandemic. Normally to get a novel new digital diagnostic platform together is a multi-year project, and we pulled it off in just a little over a year. But electronic ELISA we can use for early detection of Alzheimer's, a wide range of chronic diseases. So I think we'll see platforms emerging with this whole suite of sensors for a pretty wide range of both infectious and chronic diseases.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even like ultrasounds as well. Ultrasounds for like cardio ultrasounds of the heart and things like that. We have a smart stethoscope that's not a terahertz sensor. That's back to our we've called QCRM, a quantum cardiorespiratory monitoring platform that we can pack a lot of diagnostic power into a stethoscope.
Yeah, so very exciting tools because, again, that's been the big push. There's been a confluence of change at the general physician patient interface where we've heard of telemedicine before, but now it's just a way of life. Mm-hmm. As we move out and emerge out of the pandemic, there's still going to be this hybrid opportunity where some patients and even many physicians are going to prefer still having that distance remote monitoring and diagnosis. And so, the stethoscope, the sort of the standard legacy framework tool set is going to have to be optimized with these interesting digital sensors to be able to convey information at a distance. So there's this geographical barrier. And so it is going to be very interesting to see how products like yours at RAM Global are going to be helping to optimize the accuracy, if you will, of the diagnosis and continuous monitoring of patients. So I'm also curious, a lot of things that have happened recently with clinical trials with pharma companies to make their endpoints more resilient is they've had to consider incorporating wearable technologies and other sorts of technologies like that to get the outcomes directly from the patients. So, we're hearing about a lot of people utilizing what was already in the market. So smartwatches, the Apple Watch, 24-hour glucose monitors, and the list goes on. Where would your biometric sensors fit into this picture? Is it a standalone product, or is it really just sensors that you sell to the Apples of the world? So what is that going to look like?
It'll be a bit of both. In some cases, we may develop our own RAM Global branded device. And then we view ourselves as basically a hardware platform that, the Apples, Suntos, Fitbit, Google Fitbit, those we can be the RAM Global inside. And then, but beyond wearables, there's also, we were exploring a couple years ago, and who knows, we may get back to this once, depending on our funding and so forth, but using the GaN-based sensors to create a smart toilet that with a low-cost sensor you can put in the toilet and basically get the data that's very close to what you would get from a blood test in a clinician's office, but get it non-invasively, beamed into the cloud, get electrolyte, if you look at patients on chemotherapy, for example, electrolytes are very important to monitor, and a number of other variables. All of that we can get from your urine and things like that. So there's an example of a potentially very low cost device that can make those remote clinical trials and remote patient monitoring more robust in terms of the types of data we can get from the home. And we also do air sensors. So, I think for me as a public health guy, the air sensors are particularly exciting because the more we learn about the impact of air quality on, with Alzheimer's and aging to, our children and their cognitive development and things like, right now the air sensors that are used generally don't have really good resolution. There's a lot of algorithmic enhancement because the sensors can't go as far as what we, scientists really need. So I think the breakthrough that we can help drive is making low cost, very accurate sensors with high resolution so that we can blanket cities and get way more granular data. So you can think of how Waze has changed transportation. What would the Waze of air pollution be? What would that do? Because the science right now tells us, there's a study in Oakland, California, for example, that showed that the exposure to, I think it was PM 2.5 and certain range of gases that are, from diesel engines and so forth, in the course of one block, if one end of the block is a major thoroughfare with trucks and the other end of the block is, neighborhood, like without a lot of traffic, there's an 8-fold difference in exposures. So we're getting exposed to stuff all the time, but we can't see it. We don't measure it. We don't, so what sensors, what they fundamentally do is make the invisible visible. And once we know what it is with a higher degree of confidence, we can then build policies and, whatever we need to do to address that problem. So I view, air quality as one of the areas we can make a big difference. And imagine then when you have sensors in your watch that can monitor your heart and lung function with, very high medical acuity. And we also know what's in the air around you in real time. With the fires in California and Australia, they're seeing upticks in cardiac events and so forth. Now, to understand that in more detail, that kind of data can revolutionize how we understand, cardiology in the environment and things like that. And so that to me is like the really exciting future once we get through the COVID piece and we go back to, and include some of our other technologies we're working on and bring them to market, because coupled together, that data cloud around you. It's not, I mean, what we see often is a lot of kind of surveillance, but stuff you can't act on. And I think, you know, in the environment is hard to act on, but when we understand more concretely, we may see more actionable things we can do from that data. And then
You're
from the
seeing a lot of
interactions.
people, Jody, coming in the market now, the Googles, the Apples, the big consumer electronic companies, the Facebook, competing with the large pharma companies, all trying to get into the healthcare space. And you bring up something that's really relevant, which is we need to get away from sort of this N of one and look at the larger picture. So the point of care suddenly becomes a much more expanded place than the typical hospital or health caregiver, institution. It comes down to the place of a person's place of residence. It comes down to the place of where they drive back and forth. So the point of care is going to change, and where these sensors are going to be located and how they're going to be interacting with individuals. They could be voice activated with the typical sort of tools like you see with the Alexas. They could be the facial recognition software as you're watching TV or looking at your screen. It could be in the sets or the buttons on your stove as you're turning things on. So tell us a little bit about the future of that smart city that I think you were alluding to, and how is that point of care and getting from a place of reactive sick care to a place of proactive wellness focus. So what does that look like in this new smart city?
And I'm going to add a piece to that as well, because I think I have an issue with the first generation of smart city technologies. They tend to be very top down, and they're technologies of surveillance. We do surveillance in healthcare as well, but it's often targeted towards an individual to improve an outcome. There's a dark side of that as well, where their data is then used and sold off as another form of business. And so to me, the future of smart cities is more modular, more bottom up, more citizen engaged, and it's not the big technology platform surveillance thing. I mean, anyone who's read Shoshana Zuboff in the last year and her take on surveillance capitalism, there are very good points in there, and how sort of the ethics of what we consider smart technologies. They're not always great for us, as we've seen. There are political downsides, and then there's issues of how we democratize data and so forth. So, to me, a truly smart city also includes this, an issue, issues around equity, addressing the bias in the algorithms we use, and then engaging people as citizens and users and providing services that they need, not just doing the ones we can because we have the technology. And so I think that, to me, is more the smart city that I'm interested in. That's also why air sensors, to me, are an interesting technology, because you can build platforms where people can ingest data, and the tools for running analytics and so forth, they're becoming, they increasingly become commoditized and easier to use. So, we use the word democratized sometimes a bit too loosely. However, they're, the citizen generated smart city, to me, is what is exciting. And the first generation smart city is less appealing to me, as also a city, beyond even my role as in healthcare, but just as a citizen. So I think, that smart, healthy city and how that data can feed back into city planners and provide the data where they can, engage with communities about what needs to be done about traffic patterns near schools, or how bike routes are designed so you have less exposure to diesel exhaust and things like that. That's, to me, innovation in the smart city world will look something like that, and less of a war room with massive amounts of technology coming in from cameras and even facial recognition. I think the AI community, the AI and ethics and politics of AI community, they're deeply concerned about how facial recognition is used. And in healthcare, we do have, kind of consumer-centric uses of that. I saw an interesting example with substance abuse, so that people in substance abuse programs don't have to go to a clinic and go through the humiliating urine sample, providing that urine sample with someone watching over them. They can now do it remotely, and they have used a facial recognition, biometric authentication. They can do it in their home, and do it in a way that they're more likely to get compliance and engagement and have a better experience of that substance abuse program. So there, you can see facial recognition could be a very good thing. But on a case-by-case basis, there's more and more of a reaction against facial recognition due to the bias issues, and, a whole host of other things that are popping up with that. And that's where, a lot of the work I did with blockchain was about, more giving people control of that data, which, that you could use in smart cities, and getting people engaged with it and sharing data, and privacy, protecting secure ways, things like that. But those AI and ethics discussions are pretty much at the center of half of my work these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to there's a lot of that. And I think this is, again, part of the starting and the sustaining of those conversations, because I think the concept of privacy, security, all of this is just kind of bubbling to the top. And what does this look like in the new normal, in the new world of, us all plugging into the greater consciousness of the overall internet that we're all plugging into. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about something a little bit more futuristic, which may not be as futuristic as we think, as we really delve into blockchain, the whole world of chain link, smart contracts, Oracle networks, specifically this concept of the decentralized autonomous organization. And as we start to talk about these smart cities, and we talk about various applications to removing third parties, really monetizing, if you will, making people human IPOs, and everybody being able to tokenize everything, specifically their health data, which now is being used by large platforms, and nobody really gets reimbursed for this.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could spend a couple of minutes philosophically on some of the really interesting areas around everything from monetizing data. We read a lot about that from the Eric Topol books, to what's insurance going to look like in terms of doing things like outcomes-based agreements with pharmaceutical companies or with patients based on outcomes, to looking at like we're saying, monetizing their own data, but also potentially doing things like patients crowdsourcing their own clinical studies, mm-hmm. or their own insurance program. So what's your philosophy on what this could look like?
Interesting. My philosophies in that area is some of those areas that you just mentioned. A lot of it's based on the experience working with HealthBank, a startup out of Switzerland that we developed as a health data transaction platform with a co-op business model. So essentially, to this point, it's largely a failure, but the idea itself, I think, has potential. I think it's a good example of getting to the market too early. So what HealthBank was about doing is it created a co-op business model. And the whole idea is that, this was kind of the foundational sort of ethical bedrock where all the members of HealthBank were also shareholders in the company. And they would have control over the future of where the company would go and how data could be used. And, they could have blocks that could veto things so that their data would be used ethically. So on top of that co-op business model, we built the health data transaction platform, the Health Bank, where you could store your data, and then Health Bank would go out and do partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, nutrigenomics, pain management, you name it, and then they could pay the members of Health Bank could select to share their data and then get rewarded for data. So they could get, we were looking at, they could get payments, could help bring down the cost of their medications, insurance premiums, all of that kind of thing. So using a co-op to improve access to care, and put the monetization of your health data in the hands of the patients themselves. But the challenge we faced weren't enough patients to store the data to make it a compelling business model. We started, I think it was probably 2014, 2015, and it was, we had several partnerships and so forth, but I think it was an idea that came too soon. And during the heyday of blockchain, when the ICO bubble hit, we put together a plan for an ICO, but then I think the speculative bubble burst, and you just couldn't generate enough interest in an ICO. That market died somewhat, but I still think the basic concept of this having a co-op business model with platforms that can aggregate individual data and do this in a fair way, that's a compelling concept to me. But you're up against the Googles and the platform players who tend to build, they're monopolies, and it's an oligopoly in this round. So if you're going to try to create something very innovative in that space with tokens and all that, you have to find a way to generate the network effects to scale fast. And health data, it's slow data. And I mean, we have a lot of interoperability issues. It's patients have a hard time accessing their data across healthcare systems and apps. I mean, the apps don't interoperate. There are tools out there to help them interoperate, but so I learned the hard lesson there that I could take my futures hat and have a kind of trajectory of where you think the technology's going to go. But then where the rubber hits the road in the business model for that underlying technology in healthcare is where things go awry very quickly. And you're up against, it's a hard mountain. And I'm not saying you can't do it. I think in health banks example, we were too early, but a lot of the potential, I mean, the reason why I put a lot of blockchain work on hold was it just felt like the infrastructure needs to mature more to help me be in a position where I could work with others to build something that I could leverage those network effects to have the scale to compete. And it's a very tough environment with this current kind of, the Googles of the world to compete. Not that I think they're necessarily going to even succeed, like Amazon and Google in healthcare. I don't necessarily see them as, their model has been winner takes all in the markets they've gone into. If everyone has noticed how they've arrived to healthcare very late, and there's a lot of hype, and usually, reality comes out, 20% of where the hype hits. So I'm more like, I have to turn my futures hat, have a bit of a dim switch on it when I come to the business of doing blockchain and related types of things right now. That does not mean 5 years from now, I would think the same way.
Yeah, it's 2 steps forward and, or it's 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. I mean, it's a really interesting problem set. It's what I would call a complex problem, where you really need systems innovation thinking. And there's a lot of big picture issues, and you need to get down to basic principles, and having multiple people from across the globe working on this until we can start piecing things in together. So it's not impossible. It's just not knowable right now. One of the key issues I really believe is you brought up the book Surveillance Capitalism, which is a fantastic book. But all of our belief systems around cybersecurity, privacy, secure, all of these elements, bioethics, what's shareable and what's not, what's knowable and what shouldn't be. The concern about suddenly you're going to let the general public know all of these things about their health, and then they can't do anything about it. Exactly. And then you add extra burden because now they have anxiety. So I'm just curious as to your perspective on how we are going to adopt as a society this concept called the digital avatar, which takes us to a certain degree from the anonymous or the, the shielded into something that has a secret key or a private key because it's blockchain. There's certain parameters that are used sort of bouncing around into this metaverse, and people getting comfortable with that. How far away are we from that as a reality?
What's interesting, you mentioned digital avatars. I wrote a little piece on digital twins used in healthcare, where you can, take all the data from the electronic health record and wearables and sensors, and then create this digital twin, and then run basically it's a different simulation on how a different therapy and so forth would respond, but also maintain their privacy protections of that individual. So FDA is already using digital twins. I think it's a heart and maybe one other organ system that they're using to do trials with medical devices and so forth. So some of that, elements of that, they're here already. And then with, there's synthetic data as well that you can, where we don't have the data, we can create data that have the same features that we, desire, from the medical records. Healthcare data tends to be pretty noisy and, mislabeled, lots of different challenges when you're developing these AI applications, but, we're developing little tricks to facilitate development of the AI models that we can then do these analytics with. So I think, I see that as, it's some very interesting work. But I still, you still go back to like this last year where we had lots of data on models and simulations. You go back to March 2020 and the model debates that over the pandemic and the numbers for different countries, and that a large percentage of the population became somewhat literate in herd immunity and R naught and infectivity rates and all of this. But did we listen? I mean, there's something going on where it's definitely not more data is going to make us smarter in all cases. It's how we, so there's something in how we're communicating the data, or is the social contract so damaged from the Facebooks of the world and the debates raging over Facebook and the platforms and democracy, that people no longer trust our institutions in public health and medicine. And I think we have some serious questions to ask. And here in the U.S., just in the last several days, with rolling back the mask wearing for those that are vaccinated, the amount of confusion that is created. That was apparently based on data, but there are also political choices that are made in those policy decisions. And so I think we have to spend a lot more time understanding those types of the social lives of data and subjectivities, whether you're a patient, a consumer, a citizen. And this is why we're working on Chillmark at the moment, like trying to look at these health IT trends and then understanding these different personas or subjectivities, because we're all of the above. Sometimes we're patients, sometimes we're consumers, sometimes we're pressing for control over our data or access to care. And sometimes we're caring for a child or a spouse or a parent that's sick. And so the way we'll look at this data and think about the health system and health data and technologies varies across those different persona.
Yeah, so honestly, we could speak for hours. There are so many complexities to this, Jody, including the fact of, the one thing that COVID-19 did teach me is that you can have the exact same event occur in two different people, in front of two different people, and each of those people could see and interpret that situation as being something completely different. So it does start to make one wonder what the version of reality and how many versions of those actually exist. And then when you start throwing onto that, things like augmented reality, virtual reality, being in and out of it. We hear a lot about the metaverse and flipping in and out and having tokens and different kinds of currencies in that reality, and then kind of moving out into this 3D realities. Like the question is going to be, what is the new government going to look like? What is regulation, legal documentation going to mean when we're just starting to isolate the fact that there isn't a single solitary point of truth in this overall, I guess, picture of this fractal that we live in? So it's a very complex situation.
But I think some of the ways of thinking about these issues, we here in the US and in a lot of places, you have this binary way. You're either pro-market or, on the left, anti-market. And that's not a very helpful way of thinking about if you look at the economist Mariana Mazzucato, and kind of rethinking the role of the state in innovation. I mean, if we look at the iPhone, 85% of the iPhone, 80 or 85% of the iPhone came from federally funded grants, those components. Google, AdSense was an NSF grant. And so this thing that the state gets in the way and the market solves it, well, we see how far the market got us with COVID here in the US, and, and India is experiencing the same thing. And she's trying to help us rethink the role of the state and how we can use commons and cooperation. This is why my last book was on disruptive cooperation, because I thought that, we think about competition all the time, but not how, we need, the other way of thinking about platforms beyond, the Googles and the Facebooks would be other forms of cooperation and using the commons to innovate on that. And maybe we wouldn't have $100,000 drugs for cancer, and things like that, and rethinking this role of the state. So some of these problems, I do see some really innovative thinking, rethinking of economics and the role of the state that we need to do that could really help technology, patients, and democracy, all of the above. Yeah. And so to me, it's less about thinking futures whiz-bang technology, but let's get some of these social formations and the ethics of that in alignment with the problems, and then we might be able to cook along. Look at the work of Nesta in the UK and how they think about social innovation. There's some great work being done on that could, bring it to digital health now. And I think we could really come up with some very interesting new trajectories.
Absolutely. So we're approaching the top of the hour. Fascinating topic. I could literally speak to you for hours and hours. We'll maybe have to have you come back on the show and focus on maybe just one of the many concepts that we discussed today. For anybody listening today or watching, if you're interested in connecting with Dr. Jody Ranck, either with RAM Global and any of the multitude of sensors, some of the work they're doing with COVID-19, or really just connecting with him to find out other ways of integrating blockchain and some of these more futuristic thinking, we'll be leaving his contact details. So please look for those in the show notes. If you liked the conversation today, I'd encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. This is the kind of work that we encourage with various stakeholders, patients, payers, allied healthcare providers, physicians, and all other kinds of stakeholders, engaging them through a series of synchronous and asynchronous collaboration and communication discussions so that you can move some of these concepts forward. Everything from how are you going to integrate sensors, update your patient support programs, integrate, software as a medical device, and a myriad of other topics that you can work together and help to come to some seamless strategies and tactics. So please check out impetusdigital.com. We'd really appreciate if you can like and subscribe to this channel, and also leave us a review so that you can get notified of when more content is coming up. I want to thank everybody for their time. Thank you, Jody, for a fantastic conversation, and wishing everybody a great day ahead.